Chapter 5. The Gors and the Taluds. The story of the Gors and the Taluds begins shortly after the fall of the Rakshi Empire, its capital rendered uninhabitable. Zariel was indignant, while Chil and Efor stood before him, self-satisfied. "Do you have any idea how many people died here?" Zariel asked, still seething with anger. "I'd say tens of thousands. All that hatred and rage has given us the power we needed to create two new races that will serve only us. We'll do it on another continent, far from you, little brother. You can keep your happiness, joy, and sentimentality like that," Chil said mockingly. With that, they vanished from sight. "They're going to create more death, destruction, bloodshed, and suffering than ever before," Zariel said to himself. "But their plans will take hundreds of years to unfold, which gives me time to formulate my own plans. But I have no idea how to counter the horrors they have planned. I need someone incorruptible, someone worthy. But who?" he thought. So, he began to wander the world of Zul in search of that someone. And with so little happiness in this world, he was quite weakened. Meanwhile, on the continent of Tentrila, Chil and Efor, each working independently, began crafting their new creations. Chil, drawing on his observations of Zariel creating humans and Lumiel creating the Taluds, created the Gors. But these were not humans. They were more of a humanoid reptiles. Although Chil desired to create an improved version of humans, he was unable to, and thus had to settle for this form. He named them Gors. The most intelligent and strongest form was called Vados. He created several of them, both male and female, and left them to their own devices for the time being. The second form he created was the Padar, a somewhat less intelligent and less powerful form than the Vados. And finally, the Bunda, even less intelligent than the Vados and the Padar, or so they believed. Initially, the three groups were kept separate, each living independently of the others. Both Chil and Efor appeared to the three groups in their dreams to teach them and give them ideas on how to hunt, cultivate food, and make weapons and tools. All the while, they pretended to be benevolent gods. Efor also created the Taluds. At first, they too lived in villages while Efor appeared to them in their dreams to instruct them. However, this instruction was different. They were required to leave their villages upon reaching the age of 20 to rule a particular territory. Brute force became their ultimate ideal, and Efor allowed them to feed on both animals and members of other races, which generated anger and hatred from such races again, something that pleased both Efor and Chil. The rise of the Vados began 300 years after the advent with their first true leader, Artarex. Thanks to Chil's manipulations, he began a campaign to subdue the Padar. Their leader, Arius, did not look favorably upon his people's submission to the Vados, even though Chil insisted he submitted. Chil disliked Arius's strong will, but at the same time, the idea of him opposing the Vados would generate the hatred the spirit desired. The battle was bloody. Both sides lost many soldiers, but in the end, both leaders decided that a duel between them would settle everything. They both took up their fighting stances. Then they began to attack each other frenetically, exchanging blows with swords and shields. But Artarex, being stronger, more experienced and agile, ultimately prevailed, plunging his sword into Arius's body, who collapsed, dying. All the members of his people lowered their heads upon seeing their beloved leader dead. From now on, they would serve the Vados. But they would not forget this. They would always harbor a latent hatred and anger for their oppressors, something that Chil and Efor greatly enjoyed. Aratlil, spirit of pride, also joined them, considering that the Vados were now swollen with pride and missed no opportunity to humiliate the vanquished Padar. Several centuries passed, and the populations of both Vados and Padar Bunda increased. Chil and Efor decided it was time for the Vados to subjugate the Bunda, just as they had subjugated the Padar. The Bunda lived peacefully, though they did not associate with other races. They had established a prosperous village, which aroused the greed of the Vados. This led Tamlil, spirit of envy, and Zril, spirit of greed, to join Chil, Efor, and Aratlil. By then, the Vados had a new leader, Ani. He was an intelligent and fierce leader, and most importantly, completely devoted to Chil and Efor. He would do anything to please them. In fact, he had a temple entirely dedicated to them, and a chapel dedicated to the other spirits he considered lesser deities. The main Bunda village had no walls to protect it because its inhabitants did not expect an attack from anyone. Their leader was Rosu. He had received the warning from Zariel, but it was too late. The combined armies of the Vados and the Padar surrounded the village and began attacking all the citizens, men, women, and children. Rosu fought bravely, but the enemy was far too numerous and well-equipped. He fell fighting Anti, who demanded the surrender of all the Bunda. Seeing their beloved leader dead at Anti's feet, they capitulated. They would now serve the Vados, just as the Padar had before them. The Vados were petty, even in victory. They placed the Bunda under the Padar's control, and the Bunda, in turn, developed a hatred and anger toward the Vados, but also toward the Padar, that they viewed as complicit. And again, both Chil and Efor were pleased. Thus, of all the agricultural products the Bunda produced, they were forced to give more than half to the Vados. The Padar acted as intermediaries at the behest of the Vados. Years later, the Vados organized the army of their fledgling empire. Although Anti eventually died of old age, the other Vados wanted to keep his name alive, so they made Anti's name the title of their supreme leader. The new Anti, named Ekdek, changed the army structure to have absolute control over it. The Anti would be the commander-in-chief. His generals, called the Four Great Ones, would control the commanders and captains, all of whom were Vados. The Padar would be lieutenants, sergeants, and other lower-ranking officers, and finally, the Bunda would be the rank and file. Consequently, they would be the cannon fodder, serving at the whim of the Vados. With the three races of the Gors under their control, Chil incited them through certain members of the Vados, who formed a group called the Voice of the Gods. Chil and Efor dictated to them the propaganda they wished to spread throughout the Gors. They would serve as a priestly class and as chaplains in the army. They also taught them to read and write using the script of the ancient Rakashi Empire. But only the Vados and the Padar were taught. Aratlil told his two brothers that this could create problems in the future if some were to find ancient writings and begin to question their leader's propaganda. But both Chil and Efor ignored this warning. The first battle the new army engaged in was a human village near their own, which they called Chil City after they captured it. It wasn't a city in the strictest sense, more like a town, but Chil loved the idea, given his egomania. It was his custom to visit his temple and stand next to his own image, listening to the prayers of the various Gors, who asked for things he couldn't provide, and even if he could, he wouldn't do anything to answer them. But he loved all the attention. Anyway, back to the point. After sending spies for several days, they decided to attack, since the Gors possessed something they coveted, the knowledge of how to forge iron. So they invaded the village. All the humans who were able to fight prepared to defend it. They were better armed than the Gors, but they were few in number, so each wave of the Gors weakened their forces, and in the end, their enemies overran the entire village, forcing them to surrender. At first, the Gors only demanded that they share their knowledge with them. Then they demanded tribute, half of all the food they produced. And finally, they demanded labor for extracting iron for their forges. This generated hatred and anger toward the Gors, which pleased Chil and Efor. Centuries passed as the Gors continued to expand their territory. They took advantage of the mutual distrust that existed between the races. Humans distrusted other humans and non-humans who did the same, preventing a united front against the aggressors. Zariel suffered, unable to do anything but warn the different races about the Gor threat and the need to unite against them. But they didn't listen. In the end, Zariel and Lumiel left the continent of Tentrila and went with Kalil, Dislal, Zalal, Raphael, and Leviel. These were spirits of different positive emotions, but they received less and less energy from the people of that continent. Meanwhile, the Gors continued attacking their neighbors and stealing their knowledge and resources to expand their empire. Then they attacked a fishing village inhabited by the Aemsis. The Aemsis had managed to build small boats for fishing, but this gave Efor an idea. He asked Chil to influence the Gors to allow the Taluds to take these boats and travel to other continents, spreading anger and hatred there. Only giants could stand against them. The Taluds, imbued with the ideology Efor had taught them, did as he asked, fulfilling the wishes of both Chil and Efor. Although the Gors were adept at assimilating stolen knowledge, they couldn't improve upon what was right in front of them, and many of the Aemsis took the remaining boats and escaped to other continents. Although the Gors wanted to pursue them, Efor and Chil decided it wasn't worth the effort. The village of the Aemsis was deserted, and the Anti decided to populate it with Bunda and some Padar to administer it. They named it the city of Efor. They also tried to massacre all the lighters they found while they slept, as these were extremely strong and defeated them time and again. Efor showed them where they slept during the day, and they almost succeeded. Thus the centuries passed. They found a village of humans who had managed to decipher the writings left by the Rakhashi Empire and its opponents. The city was called Torma, and its houses and walls were made of stone blocks. So, using their usual tactic of sacrificing wave after wave of Bunda soldiers, they finally managed to destroy the city gates, but the defenders were well armed and killed many. However, the Bunda were far more numerous, and in the end, they overwhelmed the city. Once inside, the Vedos made sure to eliminate anyone who seemed to have any leadership qualities. The Vedos saw that these people possessed a wealth of knowledge they could exploit, so they decided to keep all the artisans alive but under close surveillance. Realizing that their knowledge was the only thing keeping them alive, the inhabitants of Torma decided to teach their new conquerors some techniques, but not everything. Thus, they became indispensable to their captors, while they waited for their moment to rise up against their oppressors. Of course, that moment would take a long time, but they were patient. Meanwhile, they manufactured weapons and hid them outside the city. Those who knew the location of these weapons could be counted on one hand. Even so, with the knowledge acquired from Torma, they built a magnificent temple for Chil and another for Efor, who both enjoyed all the attention. These temples were in the form of ziggurats, or Babylonian pyramid temples, each with a statue of them at the top. They also ordered the construction of walls around the city, but much higher, and many more soldiers around the gate of the aforementioned city, which they called New City of Chil. And of the Gor capital, they orders human sculptors to create gigantic statues of Chil and Efor in their Gor forms. Contrary to the meteoric rise of Felek, the Gor Empire took centuries to establish itself, though neither Chil nor Efor were in any hurry. Their main opposition, Zariel, Lumiel, and the other spirits who gained power by absorbing positive emotions, had no sources of power, or at least that's what they thought. Zariel and the others arrived at the village that would later become the city of Felek. They realized that these humans were somewhat different. They were more attached to one another than their contemporaries, even though they believed the propaganda of the Rakhashi Empire, and they didn't trust people from other villages. The leader of this village, named Paranix, who would later become Aronai's ancestor, was a person of deep emotions and an open mind, for his time, of course. He encouraged his people to try to improve the lives of others. Zariel and her siblings liked this attitude, so they stayed. And from time to time, they appeared to them in their dreams, giving them ideas. This village was therefore somewhat more advanced than the others. But let's return to the Gors. Both Chil and Efor told them, through the voice of the gods, that all other races were their hated enemies who should be enslaved or exterminated, and that they were the superior race. From each race they conquered, they demanded as tribute anything they could use and subjected the strongest to forced labor. Although the Bunda and the Padar mostly accepted the propaganda of the voice of the gods, there were some who were not convinced, but they felt they could not oppose the control of the Vedos. Oral tradition, from both the Padar and the Bunda, recalled the heroic resistance of Arias and Rosu, respectively. Some of them wanted to emulate these heroes, but didn't know how. But they secretly repeated these stories, both to the Vedos and to members of other social classes. Both Chil and Efor knew this, but they believed it would only increase the anger and hatred between the two groups, which would benefit them. They never imagined they would one day follow the example of these heroes. All members of the Gors were oviparous and kept their eggs in special nurseries, separated by social class, of course. Often, the Fords used eggs and young from both subjugated classes to intimidate them. Zariel sometimes personally visited the city of Chin and nearby villages to get an idea of how much progress they had made. Sometimes he sent Lumiel or some of his other brothers, such as Zalal, Beniel, Raphael, or Leviel, who also lived near the village that would later become the city of Felek. Of course, Zariel spent most of his time observing Paranix's village. On one occasion, when the village was experiencing a shortage of furs, Zariel appeared to Paranix in a dream. "What does my lord Zariel wish?" he asked. "I see you are having trouble obtaining animal pelts," Zariel said. "I don't know how to solve this problem," Paranix complained. "What about the elections? They are skilled hunters, Zariel said. I don't understand, my lord. The patriarch said, somewhat confused. It's simple, Zariel replied. They have a surplus of furs, and you have weapons and tools that you can trade for them. You just have to speak with them. I believe you can both benefit, Zariel advised. And so the first friendship between two peoples was born, and the first exchange of goods centuries after the fall of Rakashi. Meanwhile, in the nation of the Gors, Arias, a direct descendant of the original Arias, grew increasingly dissatisfied with the situation. He had formed a close but secret friendship with Rosu, also a descendant of the original Rosu. Both had heard from their families what the Vedos had done and wanted to do something about it, but they didn't know what. Then, when he visited the misnamed city of Tamlil, though it wasn't a city, it was more of a fishing village, the Vedos decided to send Arias there as an administrator and Rosu as his assistant. There, in the small shipyard, he observed how they build fishing boats. This gave him an idea, and he had a secret conversation with Rosu. Listen, Rosu, Arias explained. You know we don't have the weapons or the numbers to rise up against the forts. Also, many of our people believe the lies of Efor and Chill, so we can't fight them. So what do you suggest? Rosu asked, intrigued. What if we steal several fishing boats and escape far from here? Arias asked. But where to? Rosu asked, intrigued. Anywhere we can take our own decisions, without the Vedos ordering us around and threatening us all the time. Arias said. That's right. I think anywhere would be better than here. Rosu agreed. In the following weeks, under the guise of supervising them, Arias and Rosu boarded fishing boats and carefully observed the procedure for raising the sails and piloting the boats using the lever tiller. They even asked the fishermen to teach them. This surprised the fishermen, but they didn't suspect their true intentions. Of course, the fishermen didn't venture far from the bay because they feared the creatures that lived beneath the waters. Both Rosu and Arias made a mental note of this. Then day arrived, or should I say night, for Arias and Rosu took their numerous families and stole 5 fishing boats while everyone slept. They brought them to a designated spot and filled them with provisions, weapons, and tools. After that, they set sail for the open sea. Out on the open water, they could see monsters of varying sizes swimming beneath the boats in the clear waters. They were frightened, but the creatures, likely mistaking the boats for mere floating pieces of wood, left them alone. When the sun rose, the 5 boats were still sailing with the wind at their backs, but they saw no land in any direction. They were tense. They had staked everything on this plan. If they turned back, they would most likely be executed as an example to others who might try something similar. The Vedos were ruthless. Since it was their first time on a boat, half of them experienced the typical symptoms of seasickness. Several of them vomited. After a week of what seemed like an endless journey, they sighted a rather large island. So they disembarked. They dragged what they could away from the beach and assembled the carts there, so they could transport all their provisions while they found a suitable place to set up camp. They established their camp in an area full of fruit trees and noticed that there were many animals they could hunt or tame, if possible. From now on, we'll have to fend for ourselves, but we'll be free, said Rosu. The first few years will be difficult, but we'll survive, agreed Arias. The date was 800 years since the fall of Rakashi and 200 years before the founding of Felik. Soon they began cultivating the seeds they had brought, building huts first from straw and then upgrading them to log cabins. Also, freed from the prohibitions imposed by Chill through the Vedos, they began to interact with each other. They were no longer 2 families of different races. Now Padar and Bunda interacted freely, and children began to be born to them. But these little ones looked somewhat different. Over the years, the children born from the union of both races were stronger, faster, and more intelligent. By then, they realized Chill's reason for forbidding intermarriage. These new descendants were stronger and more intelligent than even the Vedos. These relationships and the love that existed between them caught Lumiel's attention. She informed Zariel. Zariel appeared to Arias and Rosu in a dream. Greetings, Lords Arias and Rosu. My name is Zariel, he said in his Gor form. What do you wish? Do you want to enslave us as Chill did? Arias asked suspiciously. On the contrary, I wish to help you free your brothers, both Padar and Bunda, and possibly also Vedos. Not everyone agrees with the things Chill and Efor are forcing the Gors to do, Zariel explained. But we are free now, Rosu protested. Yes, for now you are, but sooner or later the Gor expansion will reach you. What you need are allies to help you face them. Those allies are not yet ready. I will help you, but it may take 100 or 200 years. In the meantime, I will help you improve your lives. I know you have no reason to trust me, but I am not like Chill or Efor. I don't seek slaves or servants. I seek friends, Zariel explained. And that is how he began to connect with this dissident faction of the Gors, giving them ideas for better tools, weapons, and the construction of their homes, even how to make fishing nets. Little by little, their population increased. But Zariel kept reminding them not to let their guard down because the danger from the Vados was also growing. However, the new race that emerged from the Patri and the Bunda, later called the Efor, continued to grow stronger, and their adaptability could be compared to that of humans. Meanwhile, the village of the Efor continued to prosper thanks to the guidance of Zariel, Lumiel, Kalil, Dislal, Zalal, Benil, Raphael, and Leviel. Although Chill and Efor suspected Zariel was planning something, they believed he couldn't do anything about it. They considered their plan foolproof. 200 years passed, and the Efors had a population of 2,000. One night, Zariel appeared to Felix and Lucas. "Greetings, friends. How are you?" Zariel said, smiling in his human form. "It's been a while since you've appeared like this. You're up to something, aren't you? For someone who's only known me for a few years, you know me too well," Zariel said, smiling. "You're actually quite predictable," Felix replied. "Very well. Do you remember when I told you about the Gors?" The spirit asked. "Yes. You told us they're a threat because they're under Efor's and Chill's absolute control," Lucas answered. "Well, it turns out there's a dissident group of Gors," Zariel said. "Who are they, Zariel?" Lucas asked, intrigued. 200 years ago, there were two Padar and Bunda families who escaped from the Empire and found an island and intermingled, something they were strictly forbidden to do by Chill. Zariel explained. He knew they would end up creating a new race, stronger and smarter than the Vados. They call themselves the Efors. My brothers and I have been in communication with them all this time. Guys, Zariel explained. I'm used to you not giving us all the information, but I don't think you do it on purpose, Felix said. I'm glad you understand, Zariel replied. Very well. Where is this island you're talking about? Lucas asked. It's halfway between Aretna and Tentrila. Several days by boat. The Vinfos know where it is. They can guide you. The Efors want to free the Gors from the tyranny of Chill and the Fords, although not all the Fords agree with what their people are doing, but they don't act for fear of reprisals. By the way, Lucas, I love that you introduced board games to the population. This life, it's not just about work, Zariel commented. Oh no, Taze is the one doing all the work. I think he deserves the credit, Lucas replied. I only gave him the ideas, which, by the way, aren't mine. Lucas defended himself. Yes, I know those have existed in your world for decades, even centuries. But the fact that you decided to share them with your people is admirable, Zariel said, making Lucas uncomfortable with so much praise. The expedition consisted of Felix, Lucas, Una, Aneto, Artemis, Alacker, and Camator. They all headed towards Loomis, accompanied by 2 carts loaded with various goods, to trade and establish friendly relations. Upon arriving in Loomis, they were greeted by Aelios and his assistant, now wife, Lexa. Good morning, Lords Felix, Lucas, Camator, and the rest of your party. Lord Zariel told me we might have more allies against the Gors, greeted the now administrator of Loomis. Actually, they are also Gors, but they aren't under Chill's influence, replied Felix, surprising Aelios. Oh, I didn't know that, said Aelios. Zariel again, withholding information. What an annoying habit, thought Felix. The next day, after resting from their journey, they all boarded the Defender, which raised its sails and set sail for the island of the Efors, guided by Maya and other members of the Vinfos, who had their harpoons ready in case of an attack by any underwater creature. The voyage was completed without incident. They arrived at the beach where the Efors waited patiently, having been notified the night before by Lumiel, whom they also held in high esteem. Welcome, Lords of Felak, announced Ares the Sixth, who was accompanied by Rosu, also the sixth in line since their 2 families arrived on the island. Greetings, my name is Felix, and these are Lucas, my brother, Una, Aneto, Artemis, Alacker, and Camator. Felix introduced himself to the others. I am Ares, this is Rosu, and these are my other companions, he said, extending his hand, whose fingers ended in impressive claws. just as Zariel and Lumiel had taught them was the custom of humans and other races. Felix shook it, noticing how strong his grip was. After the formalities, everyone walked toward the village of the Ephors. There they saw some Padar Bunda elders, who looked at them curiously, as it was the first time they had seen members of other races. There were also children watching them. The guests toured the entire village of the Ephors. They saw their cultivated fields, their livestock, and even the ponds where they raised fish for consumption. Furthermore, their houses and other buildings were made of precisely cut stone blocks to give the structure stability. All of this impressed Felix and the rest of his companions. At the end of the tour, everyone returned to the village and gathered in a kind of conference room where they explained the details of their alliance. Gentlemen, I understand that an alliance between our nations may be complex, but the benefits will be rewarding, Felix explained. Lord Zariel told us that you would help us rescue our brothers from the control of the Vados, Chill, and Euphril, Rosu said. That's the plan, but we're not ready yet, was Lucas' answer. We have nearly 10,000 soldiers from all the races, but we have no way to transport them all to Trinola. The Loomis shipyard can't keep up with the demand to build a fleet large enough for everyone, Lucas explained. We have fishing boats, but we've never seen a ship like the one you arrived on, Arias said. If you'd like to learn how to build ships like that, our shipwright can teach yours, Felix said. That would be wonderful, Rosu commented. We also brought several of our agricultural products, tools, and weapons. And if you'd like to learn how to make the weapons and tools, we have an expert blacksmith in Loomis. Thus, they continued finalizing details of the new diplomatic relationship between the two nations. It was decided that a delegation would visit Loomis for a trade, cultural, and technical exchange. Both Arias and Rosu were part of that delegation, but there was also a shipwright named Roxu and a blacksmith named Trintu, in addition to several guards protecting their leaders. Upon arriving in Loomis, they were impressed by the shipyard. There, they were introduced to Zenjace, who at first acted fearfully because he had never seen a Gor before. He found them intimidating. Don't worry, Mr. Zenjace, Roxu said reassuringly, extending his hand. The carpenter shook it, calming down a little. When Lucas returned to check on Zenjace, he found him chatting animatedly with his new college about nautical matters while showing his creations to the Efor. Lucas smiled and left them alone. Zenjace hadn't had anyone to talk to about his passion since his assistant wasn't very talkative. Meanwhile, Felix was introducing Trenta to Telminus. Trenta had never seen an Acaro in his life, while Telminus had never seen a Gor. Both felt awkward. Trenta glanced at Arias, who gave him a disapproving look, while Telminus looked at Felix. Come on, Telminus. They look different, but that doesn't make them enemies. The blacksmith realized this and extended his hand to Trintu. Lord Felix is right. We have people of all races here, Telminus finally said. Trenta shook it. Hours later, Felix and Rosu returned and found them working together, sharing their respective knowledge of metallurgy. Arias observed the agricultural techniques of the nation of Felic and considered applying them when he returned to his island. At lunchtime, everyone went to the dining room next to Elios's office. The visitors enjoyed the Felic cuisine, especially the dishes containing potatoes, along with other products that resembled sweet potatoes, as well as the seasonings used in the various dishes. Volunteers were requested to serve as technical ambassadors in various fields. They were also introduced to the Talaris, but decided to postpone the introduction to the Lighters due to their history with the Gors. However, they were formally introduced to the Vinfos. It was decided that Zariel would explain to the Lighters that the Ephors were not their enemies and could, in fact, be their allies. Continue on episode 6.